How do you draw arms? It seems easy at first, but if you look closer, the more lumps and bumps and mysterious grooves there seems to be. But don't worry. I'll take you through 5 different levels of drawing arms from easiest to very hard. Let's get started. When I first started drawing arms, it looked something like this. Basically, I was just thinking of the upper arm and forearm as 2 rectangles that are about the same length. I mean, I guess this gets the idea across, at least. However, drawing it like this looks kind of flat, like a paper cutout. How can I make it look more believable? It's actually pretty easy. All you have to do is add a single line like this, and already it looks more 3D. The difference here is that instead of thinking of arms as 2D rectangles, we're trying to think of 3D cylinders. And while this line over here is small, it is important because it shows where these 3D forms overlap. This concept of overlapping is really important in creating depth in your drawings by showing which things are in front of each other. We'll often see many overlaps when there is a lot of depth in a drawing. For instance, when something is foreshortened. Another really powerful tool that can help show depth is cross contours. Cross contours are any line that wrap around the form. I find it pretty convenient to use them as guidelines when sketching to help me feel the 3D space better. And they aren't limited to just guidelines. A very common cross contour that often exists on the arm is sleeves. And while sleeves might seem pretty simple, I used to get them wrong all the time. And that's because the power of cross contours can sometimes backfire. Take a look at this. When I get the curvature of the sleeve wrong, it makes the arms look super flat. I learned that I had to pay close attention to anything that could be a cross contour and take special care to make sure it was curving around the cylinder properly. And with just these simple tips, we can already draw basic 3-dimensional arms. And this is already plenty if we're looking to draw thinner arms with less definition. But what if we want more? I've been talking about cylinders, but take a look at this. Does this really look like a cylinder to you? It's way more complicated. Unlike a perfect cylinder, arms can get thinner and thicker in certain places. Let's start at the shoulders. I like to draw in the shoulders as a sphere, and a little below that, the upper arm muscles are pretty big too, which is why we see them bulging out a little. And right below that is where the elbow is. The joints tend to have less muscle and fat around that area, and I like to draw it as a sphere too. If you feel your own elbow, you can feel the bone through the skin. Right below that, we have a bunch of forearm muscles, so the arm becomes wider again, and closer to the hand, we get the wrist, which is another thinner, bony joint. The shape of the forearm to me looks a little bit like a chicken drumstick. Now, if we keep all of these varying thicknesses in mind, we end up with something like this. Now this looks much more like an arm. However, we can still go further. Let me explain. What does an arm look like if we look at it from the front? Like this? Not exactly. A real-life arm's shape is a lot weirder. You might have seen this diagram floating around where they compare the arm to a chain, but how exactly does that work? If we think about one link of a chain, it's wider in one direction and narrower in the other. And if we join 2 links together, the wide parts will be aligned almost perpendicularly to each other. The shoulder, upper arm, and forearm act a little bit like 3 links of a chain. Now, the chain visualization is helpful and all, but personally, I had a big problem with it. It's fine and all to say that the forearm is wider in one direction, but which direction is that exactly? The arm can rotate in so many directions. The shoulder rotates, the wrist rotates. How can we keep track of it all? Fortunately, there is a way. Let's talk about joints for a second. There are different types of joints in the body. For example, the shoulder and hips are ball and socket joints. They can rotate in many directions. The elbow, however, is a hinge joint, which means it can only bend in one direction. Keeping track of this direction is super helpful to me because it helps me figure out where the arm gets wider. If we think of the arm bending like this, we probably already know that the bicep bulges out like this. And on the opposite side, we have the triceps. These 2 large muscles mean that the upper arm is wider in the same direction that the elbow bends. Whereas for the forearm, it's the opposite. The widest part is perpendicular to the movement of the elbow, usually. When is it not? Well, I'll talk about that later. And finally, we can attach the shoulder as another link of the chain on top, and that's how we can easily draw an arm. Or is it? Because there's even more we can do. Take a look at this arm. Isn't there something kind of wrong with it? It looks kind of puffy and symmetrical, like a snowman. When drawing the human body, symmetry is the enemy. Let's figure out how we can fix this. Let's take a look again at this photograph of an arm. If we mark all the parts of the arm that are the bulkiest, Notice how these points are never directly opposite from each other? In fact, if we draw a line between them, it zigzags down the arm. And it's this zigzagging that creates a sense of flow or rhythm in the arm. So how do we figure out exactly where these wide parts of the arm are? Well, unfortunately, at this point, we can no longer avoid learning anatomy, which is the study of the actual muscles and bones of the body. I guess we can start by going online and looking up some anatomical diagrams for reference. Hang on a second. This one looks a bit weird. That's not where the biceps are, or the other biceps, or the triceps and the muscle, and also the INSA chain, which isn't even a word, by the way. Uh-oh. I think this is AI. There's also this diagram that looks kind of fine at first glance, but the triceps and the forearms are just a nonsensical jumble of muscle fibers that make no sense. And wait, is that a nipple muscle? Unfortunately, trying to learn and find good references these days is getting more and more difficult due to the proliferation of AI-generated imagery. Nowadays, it might actually be more reliable to look up references from existing books. One of my favorites is Anatomy for Sculptors. But whoa, look at all these muscles. It's a little overwhelming. However, don't worry. We don't have to remember all of these. In fact, we don't even have to remember most of these. For the arm, I really only think about 6 different muscle groups. Let me take you through them. Let's go from top to bottom. To start with, of course, we have the deltoid, or shoulder muscle on top. It's a big teardrop shape that's a bit boxier on top. We also talked about the biceps and the triceps before, which are located here and here. The biceps can be simplified into a pretty straightforward bump shape most of the time, but the triceps is a bit different. It tends to bulge towards the top, and there's a flat tendon at the bottom. This is especially obvious when the arm is straight. And between the triceps and biceps, we have the brachialis, a small muscle that separates them. As for the forearm, there are a couple of major muscle groups to worry about. The extensors are a group of muscles that straighten the wrist. They're mostly on the back and thumb side of the arm. There's also the flexors, which bend the wrist. These take up a bit less space, existing mostly on the pinky side and front side of the arm. A super useful bony landmark to pay attention to is, once again, the elbow. Except now we're also going to pay attention to the bone it connects to, the ulna. You can actually see a clear groove along the side of the arm, flowing from the elbow all the way down to the pinky. And this groove separates the flexors and extensors. But I still haven't talked about the most important muscle group, the one that is most responsible for the feeling of flow within the arm. And it's different from all the other muscles we've talked about so far. These are the ridge muscles. They're pretty large muscles that have a big effect on the silhouette of the arm, so I think it's important to know how they work. They actually start about halfway down the upper arm, around where the brachialis starts, and flow all the way down to the thumb. Though the part near the wrist is mostly just tendons and stuff, and the bulky part of this muscle ends about halfway down the forearm. So what exactly is so different about this muscle? Unlike the other muscle groups, these ones are connected to both the upper arm and the forearm. And this is important because, look at this. The wrist can rotate! Oh wait, you already knew that? Anyway, the important thing is that the ridge muscles get stretched and pulled as the wrist rotates and changes shape. It curves further around the arm as the wrist continues to turn. And with this, there we have it. Just knowing these 6 muscle groups on the arm is good enough to draw believable, anatomically correct arms. And remember, anatomy is hard. At least it was for me. And it wasn't something I could learn just by watching YouTube videos. It was important for me to go and actually practice by drawing arms as well. This is how I like to study anatomy. I like to start by finding an anatomy diagram and just copying it out to memorize it. It's really helpful for me to draw it out from several different angles. And then I find some reference images and copy those, but not just thoughtlessly. Every time I draw a line, I try to guess which muscle I'm actually trying to portray. If I can't remember, it's no big deal. I just look up the reference image again to figure it out. And then I try to draw from imagination, doing my best to keep the anatomy in mind. Basically, what I found out is that if I did this enough times, it eventually became second nature. And honestly, there's no need to go further than this. This is a pretty good place to stop. But what if we want to go even further beyond? Once again, here are all the muscles we just covered, but of course there are a lot of muscles we skipped. The arm actually looks like this. But wait, before we panic, sure, there are a lot of muscles here, but do we really have to know them? Besides, even this isn't all the muscles on the arm. This is only the surface layer. Below that, we have tons of other muscles that do all sorts of things. Although fortunately, unlike doctors, we artists don't really have to worry about them because we only care about the muscles we can actually see. So maybe this isn't so bad. I mean, look, there are all these tiny little muscles on the arm, but if they don't show up... Oh, dang it! Okay, to be fair, these little muscles probably don't show up on most people, unless they're incredibly shredded and haven't had any water for the last couple of months or something. So unless you really want to draw something really specific, like say superhero comics, or if you're just a nerd like me, you probably won't have to remember them. In fact, you probably don't have to learn any anatomy at all if you prefer simpler and more stylized artwork. It's really up to you what your own goals are and what you want to draw. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful. If it was, draw some arms for the subscribe button, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye!